Should I see myself now? Welcome to Cornell and to the fourth episode of our One Health Around the World series, featuring the work of the Cornell K. Yang Center for Wildlife Health. My name is Dr. Steve Osofsky, and as director of the center, I want to personally thank Lisa Yang for her vision and for her generosity to Cornell University and specifically to our wildlife health work. We do this work because we very much believe that we need nature and now nature needs us, and I'm going to explain what that means a bit. For those of you who are new to our series, I want to just tell you a little bit about the Cornell K. Yang Center for Wildlife Health. Our vision is about ensuring a healthy future for wildlife, people, and planet. And our mission is to transform science into impact through discovery, education, engagement, and policy to ensure a healthy future for wildlife and the environment that supports us all. And as I said, we do this because we need nature and now nature needs us. And what I mean by that is we need nature for all the incredible ecosystem goods and services it provides to us, from clean water to clean air to climate mitigation services to things like nutrition, which we're going to hear a lot about today. But why does nature need us? A lot of people think nature will be just fine. Nature needs us to be more mindful stewards than we've been, to manage nature thinking about future generations, and instead of mining what's left of wild natural resources, to treat them like money in the bank and try and live off the interest that nature provides so that future generations, again, can benefit from all of these important, critical services that ecosystems and biodiversity provide to us. Next slide, please. So I just want to quickly run through the 5 pillars that capture much of the work that those of us involved with the center are involved with. We respond to health threats to the survival of key species. Many of us provide landscape-level guidance on wildlife-compatible land use policy and practice to governments, for example. We work to minimize disease transfer at that interface between wildlife, livestock, and people. And that's really the whole One Health concept, is about recognizing these inextricable links between our own health, the health of our domestic animals, the health of wildlife, and how all of this is tied to environmental stewardship. Obviously, a big focus for us is training the next generation of wildlife health and conservation leaders. And those first 4 pillars all roll up into this final pillar, which I call building new constituencies for wildlife conservation. And I can tell you that many countries in the world are struggling with basic services, with being able to provide their citizens with public health, with nutritious food. So biodiversity conservation under those circumstances is a luxury. But part of what we do is try and demonstrate with our governmental partners and others how conservation can pay dividends for public health, for agriculture, and ultimately for the economy. So if we can do that, we create a whole new audience for conservation as a societal good. I want to now introduce the first of 3 speakers. We have a fantastic set of presentations today. And our first speaker is Dr. Katie Fiorella. She's an environmental scientist and epidemiologist focused on understanding the complex interactions among environmental change and community well-being, food systems, and nutrition. Her work is focused on global fisheries and the people that depend upon these environmental resources for food as well as income. Dr. Fiorella uses interdisciplinary methods to explore how ecological and social systems interact, the ways communities and households adapt to and mitigate environmental change, and the links between human well-being and ecological sustainability. Katie, thanks so much for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Steve. So I'm really glad to be here with you all today to talk about aquatic ecosystems and the people that work in and eat from them. So One Health really speaks to the reciprocal relationships that exist between people and nature, and how global fisheries really connect us all is a lens through which my research group is trying to examine how environmental and social changes affects both ecosystems and people's health and well-being. So we focus on fisheries and aquaculture in this work, and we really frame aquatic ecosystems as about aquatic food systems. So I'm going to focus today first on the big picture look at aquatic food systems and the growing aquaculture sector, and then we'll zoom in to look at an example of inland Cambodia and some specific research there. And the subsequent talks will then take us to the Amazon and to Lake Victoria in Kenya, which is actually shown in the images on this slide as well. So I want to start today by giving you a picture of global fish consumption and where it's going. So this graph shows aquatic food consumption over time. Aquatic foods are the gray line, alongside shifts in consumption of other animal source foods. And so the key takeaway here is that similarly to many other animal source foods, aquatic food consumption is growing pretty rapidly. And in addition to being a really unique source of protein, providing omega-3 fatty acids, fish also contribute a really substantial quantity of micronutrients. There's a good deal of variation by species. So this is a really nutritious food source that offers a lot of health benefits to people. And more than being just nutritious, fish is also seen as particularly sustainable and a sustainable source of these really important nutrients. And that's because it takes much less greenhouse gas emissions to produce fish than other animal source foods. There's, of course, variation across production systems, but in general, they offer a good deal of sustainability in production as well. But the growing demand is going to require more production. So fish are going to need to continue to be harvested in really large quantities from wild fisheries, which you see here in blue. But they're also going to increasingly come from aquaculture production, which is shown here in yellow. Aquaculture is now more than half of global fish produced. And as you can see in this graph, it's rapidly expanding. So it's the fastest growing food system segment today at about 7.5% per capita growth. Global per capita fish supply has increased from 9 kilograms in 1961, towards the start of this graph, to 20.8 kilograms in 2022. And in contrast, wild fish production has been basically flat for the last 30 years. We're harvesting most fisheries at capacity, and factors like climate change or overharvest threaten that wild fish supply and our ability to keep harvesting it at these levels. But the production growth is really going to come from aquaculture. So it's worth noting, however, that the large majority, 90% of that production is in Asia. And aquaculture is also predominantly from freshwater fisheries. So 62% of production is in freshwaters. And as with any other animal source food, around the world, there are really big disparities in consumption. So the percentages at the top of these bars show the proportion of global aquatic food consumption in that region. So highlighting 70% of that is in Asia, and a much smaller fraction in North America. And in this graph, the other thing I want to point out is the different color bars, which correspond to the different groups of fish species and aquatic food species that people are consuming. So not only do we eat a wide diversity of aquatic food types everywhere, there's also a good deal of variation around the world in which types. So for example, the yellow color is freshwater fish species such as tilapia, catfish, carps, and they're the largest share of consumption in Asia, also the largest share of consumption globally, and a really substantial portion of consumption in all global regions. So we often tend to think about our marine species, and certainly they're really important, but also underlining the importance of a lot of these freshwater species too. In much of the world, people are really closely interlinked with surrounding ecosystems and consume fish that is locally available to them. But some of the highest consumption of aquatic foods is in those coastal regions and around inland lakes and rivers. Yet aquatic foods are also really widely traded. So especially in industrialized food systems like in the US, the movement of these foods can be really substantial. So this map shows the flows of aquatic foods around the world. In the United States, around 80% of the aquatic foods we consume are imported, which means our food supply is very connected to ecosystems around the world where these aquatic foods are produced. Aquatic foods are all available all around the world, and they are astoundingly biodiverse. So there are more than 31,000 fish species that have been described, thousands of which are consumed in different parts of the world. In the US, we consume a relatively smaller proportion of these on a really regular basis, but this wide variation is still a really important feature of the global context of fisheries. And that biodiversity really matters, both because it reflects the different roles that fish play in ecosystems and because fish have different quantities of nutrients and are used differently. So for example, these are a small pelagic fish from Lake Victoria called daga, and there are also much larger species of fish in that same lake, including Nile perch and tilapia, that are commonly harvested. And the nutrients available in fish are really vital, and particularly for young children and their brain development. Young kids are predominantly accessing the omega-3 fatty acids in fish through breast milk. And we find that not just the quantity of fish consumed by the mother, but also the species of fish she's eating, whether it's daga or the tilapia or Nile perch, affects the fatty acid composition of breast milk. So because the species of fish consumed shapes which fatty acids are available, this really highlights how the differences between species can matter nutritionally in the nutrients people are accessing from them. More than that, around Lake Victoria, fishing families are also trading off between the different species that they consume and sell based on their value. So oftentimes fishing families will sell the high value, larger species that they catch, like tilapia and Nile perch, and then purchase daga to consume, which you see here again in the picture. So we find that in these communities, access to fisheries benefits early child development through both of these pathways, through the income generated from fishing Nile perch and tilapia, and also by eating the nutritious daga. So this further underlines how these diverse species really benefit human health and well-being. This is also a global pattern. Around the world, small pelagic fish are less expensive, more abundant, and key sources of micronutrients. These fish are particularly nutritious often because they're consumed whole. So when you eat a fish whole, you're getting the calcium from the bones, additional micronutrients from the head, which allows them to be preserved. And they're also cheaper and can be sold in small quantities, so they're more accessible. Another option for these fish is drying them, which allows them to be preserved over time and transported more easily over space as well. And another key advantage of really small fish is that they're often abundant. They tend to have a shorter lifespan, reproduce more quickly, and this can mean that they have less of an environmental impact as well. And this abundance matters because there are a lot of reasons to worry about the loss of biodiversity in aquatic ecosystems, and particularly freshwater ones. So there's been an 83% decline in freshwater biodiversity since 1970. And there are a lot of forces negatively affecting freshwater biodiversity. So dams are playing a really acute role in reshaping ecosystems. Many fish are migratory. Their life cycle involves the movement of eggs or larvae through a riverine system, and dams disrupt these processes. So we're looking here at the dams that are planned and under construction in the Mekong region. So for example, for a country like Cambodia that's towards the end of the Mekong's route, it's a really fundamental threat to fisheries. Pressure on these ecosystems also comes from pollution, invasive species, and harvest pressure. These photographs are all from Lake Victoria, and the top photograph shows harmful algal bloom, which is increasingly persistent and widespread around the world. And the middle photograph is of Nile perch, an introduced fish species that transformed the lake's ecology half a century ago. And finally, for many people, fishing is a really critical source of food and income, and an opportunity with low barriers to entry and a faster timeline than something like agriculture. So relative to other occupations, pressure has really remained high. And beyond that, we also have the impacts of climate. So in these freshwater systems, they're often shallower, more hydrologically distinct. So migratory options for fish are more limited. So this shows the U.S. Great Lake fish species and their thermotolerance, increasingly a concern for how we think about the future of these fish species as well. So with that context in mind, I want to highlight an example from Cambodia. So this is a small-scale fisher in Cambodia's rice field fisheries, and he's throwing out his net. And the studies that I'll share today ask about how the biodiversity in the system provides for small-scale fishing families and how these families see the future of that ecosystem. So while we're looking at one person in context, the livelihood of about 1 in 12 people globally depends, at least in part, on small-scale fisheries. So like this one, and the small-scale fisheries provide at least 40% of the global fish harvest. So while we call them small, their impact is not small at all. So this case takes place around the Tonle Sap Lake. This is the site of the highest per capita inland fish harvest in Cambodia, and it also has particularly high levels of biodiversity, with hundreds of species in the ecosystem and hundreds being consumed. And so the whole system is shaped by an annual flood pulse. And what that means is that water coming from the Mekong River that's down the right-hand side of the screen annually joins up with the monsoon rains to flood the lake and swell its size. So it looks like this when that happens. And so the water from the lake moves out into the surrounding flooded forests and rice field ecosystem. And the fish in this system are really attuned to this flood pulse. So they migrate out of the lake to eat and reproduce, signaled to return to the lake by the receding floodwaters. And this is a system that will be really disrupted by climate change and extensive dams on the Mekong, as Cambodia is reached late by the waters on that river as well. And so in this community, we used a methodology called photo voice to better understand how fishing families see their ecosystem and its future. So I worked with the Center for Khmer Studies and students at Cornell on this photo voice project. This is a participatory methodology, and we provided people with cameras and a prompt about what is the story of fish diversity in your life. And this is a portrait of some of the photographs that they took. So one initial takeaway that the photos generated is really the richness of biodiversity people are using in their lives and the ways in which they're valuing it. So people took photographs that represented this range of aquatic species. So several of which you can see here, from different fish species to mollusks, crabs, and more. And I'll share a few of the quotes from participants about their photos. So one participant said, "It represents our good health and we have energy. Fish have good vitamins. I feel happy when I get fish to cook as food for our everyday life." And another one really echoed the sentiment, saying, "The biodiversity surrounding my community provides me enough variety of fish to support our livelihood. Therefore, we don't have to buy food from outside sources." But at the same time that people were really highlighting the many values of biodiversity in their lives, they also highlighted a whole host of challenges that they're facing and concerns about the longevity of their work in these systems. So I think this quote really encapsulates some of this distress of the situation by saying, "We caught only a small quantity of fish. I am upset when I think about making a living from this. The fish that I caught don't even fill up the container. It only filled up the bottom of the container." So people were really also sharing ways that they were responding by moving away from fishing to focus on rice cultivation or lotus flower production, given these challenges, or moving altogether to work in more urban markets in the city. Others also asked for additional support for enforcing regulations or changing regulations to reduce conflict with other types of fishers and to increase stocking. So people are really thinking about the future of these fisheries and what's possible for them there. So given the value of biodiversity and the threats that are being highlighted to it, we designed the next study to better understand how biodiversity moves from ecosystems to people's dinner plates. So we often think about different food groups as being really important nutritionally, and that's certainly valuable. But the diversity of diets, both across and within a food group, is linked to nutrition. So the biodiversity within food groups has shown links to improved nutritional adequacy of diets as well. And the other reason we really wanted to understand this is how biodiversity moves through the system is that when we don't have detailed information about what households are doing, we use the commercial species, meaning those that are traded widely or tracked in government indices, to stand in for what's available in the ecosystem and also what people are eating. So for example, in Cambodia, the FAO tracks 20 species. But of course, this is a simplification of what's really available in that ecosystem. So we wanted to better understand the real use of biodiversity. So the first question is, what is the relationship between biodiversity in the ecosystem and in households' catch? And so we looked at this question in communities around 40 community fish refuge sites. So these are inland protected areas that provide an additional habitat to conserve biodiversity and increase catch. And we use data from these refuges to understand the biodiversity in the ecosystem. And we also use data from households living nearby that documented which species they caught, as well as which species they sold and which species they consumed. And this data was collected by World Fish and its partners. And so we find that the number of species in the ecosystem is associated with biodiversity of species caught, consumed, and sold. So in other words, how many species are in the ecosystem shapes what people are using. And that's true even when we take into account the differences between households. So on average, households catch 45% of the species in the ecosystem and consume 43% of them. So they're eating nearly all of what they catch in biodiversity terms. But on average, for sail biodiversity, we only use about 9% of the ecosystem species. So we also find that those species, that 9% that people sell, tend to be more common, larger, and less nutritious compared to the ones that they're consuming. So this really highlights the extent to which the ecosystem shapes people's fish access and nutrition. Also, that looking at the species sold risks misrepresenting both the real ecosystem biodiversity and consumption biodiversity, and missing the true value of these ecosystems for people. And how we value ecosystems really matters when we're making complicated decisions about how to use freshwaters for energy production, for example. So I'll come back to this picture that we started with and leave you with the thought that these freshwater ecosystems face a really common constellation of pressures that ecosystems around the world are facing: harvest pressure, habitat conversion, climate change, pollution, and more. And they still support really astounding levels of biodiversity and are integral parts of global food systems. They supply wild foods and often to some of the most vulnerable people around the world. Yet they're changing quickly amid expanding aquaculture as well. So I think in a much bigger picture sense, we stand just on the precipice in this picture, and our global decisions about the fate of both fishers and freshwater ecosystems hang in the balance. The scale of dependence, as much as it can be a threat to these fisheries, is also a reason for hope and opportunities for management that will really provide for the longevity of these food systems and sustainable expansion of aquaculture as well. So I want to acknowledge the partners on the work that I shared and our funders as well. And thank you all so much for listening.
It was great, Katie. Thanks for sharing such rich food for thought and discussion. And in the interest of time, we'll hopefully have time for discussion at the end. But I'd like to next bring in one of your team members, postdoctoral fellow Dr. Sebastian Halpern, an ecologist and sustainability scientists focus on understanding the causes and consequences of biodiversity change. He's particularly interested in the intersection between aquatic ecosystems, fisheries, and food security. And today he's going to share a bit about his work in the Amazon. Sebastian, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Steve, for the introduction, and Katie for setting the stage. I'm going to deepen a little bit our conversation about biodiversity, specifically in its role in providing people with a nutritious source of food, but also in its role in terms of being able to advance the resilience of both fisheries as well as ecosystems. And I like to start with this picture because it nicely frames some of these major challenges at the intersection of human and ecosystem health. So this is a picture that I took about 6 years ago from the Peruvian city of Iquitos in the Peruvian Amazon. This is one of the largest cities on the planet that are not connected to the rest of the country via a grid. So the only way to get there is by boat or by plane. So from the outset, you see that rivers are really important. This is a picture that I took around 5:30 in the morning. The boats just arrived. They're transporting a lot of people. They transport goods like plastic, and the boat to the right that you see. And they also transport food. And one of the food items that these rivers and boats transport are also food items that they provide, specifically fish. So this fellow here is bringing this large arapaima species. It's one of the largest freshwater fish on the planet. And this specific individual came from about 200 kilometers downstream. And so we see that these urban areas are driving and demanding for fish and meat from across the landscape. And the impact of these urban areas are felt across the full riverscape. And so today, I want to deepen the conversation about how biodiversity specifically is important for these aquatic food systems, but also how these food systems and this demand for fish is driving changes in biodiversity. And I hope to be able to provide us with insights about how the biodiversity itself can help align both people's and ecosystems' health. And I want to answer this question thinking about the Amazon, which is Earth's largest and most diverse freshwater ecosystem. It's located in South America, and the map on the bottom left you can see. But I want to emphasize that a lot of what I'm going to talk about is globally applicable to other places where people depend heavily on fisheries. So the Amazon is, again, Earth's largest and most diverse freshwater ecosystem. We oftentimes think about it as this massive forest, but up to 20% of the Amazon is underwater at some point during the year. This is a flood pulse dynamic like the Tonle Sap, what Katie talked about. And so if you ask me, this is a massive freshwater ecosystem. And that city of Iquitos that I was talking about earlier is in the north of Peru, where all of those rivers come to meet each other and form the main stem Amazon. And in this place, in this region, people eat a lot of fish. And so we've estimated that on average, people might consume about 50 kilograms per year per person. So this is an average, but just to put it into context, this is some of the highest rates of fish consumption across the world, up there with Japan, up there with Cambodia. And to put that into more context, in the US, we consume about 120 kilograms per year per person of animal source protein, so including cattle, poultry, et cetera. So a little bit less than half of that would be in the form of fish that people consume. And it's not only this incredible amount, but also this incredible diversity. So we've estimated about 120 species, although there's probably many more. And these species vary from large migratory catfish to a variety of smaller carassiforms, so these scaled fish that you can see in the picture in the background, to even freshwater stingrays. So it's not only this incredible diversity in terms of the names that we put to these species, but also a diversity in terms of species ecologies, from species that migrate long distances and are predators to species that eat algae that accumulates at the bottom of rivers and don't migrate that much. So a wide variety of ecologies and taxonomies. Ultimately, people are consuming a lot of fish and a wide diversity because fish tend to be more accessible than other animal sources or animal protein sources like cattle and chicken. What does that mean? They are cheaper at market. They tend to be easy to procure. You just need a net and a hook to be able to start going out and capturing some fish. I like to highlight that food is culture. And so if fish is food, then fish is culture. And we can really see this interconnectedness in terms of how people relate to fish and the diversity of fishes in their diets, in terms of how people like to prepare different dishes of fish, to when people like to consume those fish. And all of that reflects, again, that greater biodiversity available within the system. And it's not only protein that people obtain when they consume fish, but they also obtain a variety of different essential micronutrients, things like iron, zinc, calcium, omega-3s, which are really important for brain development, and even a variety of different vitamins. And it turns out that not all fish are the same. Some fish, like this guy that I've highlighted right here, might have really high omega-3 content, but it has relatively low micronutrient content, zinc and iron. Other fish species, like this one, might have low omega-3 content, but they might have high micronutrient content. And so not only do fish vary in terms of any individual nutrient, but they also exhibit this complex covariation structure. What do I mean by that? Well, some species have high something, but low something else. And because no one species can give you everything that you need, that's why biodiversity is important. In other words, species vary and they complement each other. And this idea of complementarity is not new in your food diet, in your diets. It is the foundation of the food guide period. Now, this has been replaced by other heuristics, but the basic idea is this: you can't get everything that you need from bread. You can't get everything that you need from milk and yogurt. And so that's why you need multiple things in your diets. I just do want to highlight that fish are lumped together in that box together with meat, poultry, eggs, dry beans, but they're so variable. And it's that diversity that ultimately can improve people's nutrition and lead to better diets. Okay, so fish provide a lot of benefits, right? But of course, we also know that fish come with certain risks. And one of the risks that we are quite concerned about when it comes to consuming fish has to do with mercury content. So fish are one of the main conduits by which humans are exposed to mercury. This is an issue globally, but it's an issue that's very salient in the Amazon. So the Amazon is experiencing a boom in artisanal gold mining, and gold mining utilizes mercury as a binder. That mercury then finds itself in waterways, finds itself in food webs and in fish and ultimately in peat points. So there's certain amounts of risks associated with consuming so much fish. At the same time, the same fisheries that sustain millions of people's diets are also driving changes in that same biodiversity. Overexploitation, the process of extracting too much biomass from rivers and oceans, is having profound impacts on biodiversity. And just as species vary in terms of their nutritional quality, in terms of their mercury content, species also vary in terms of how vulnerable they are to some of these pressures like overexploitation. For example, these large migratory catfish, they're declining a lot more rapidly than some of the smaller species. Why is that? Well, they have ecological traits like being large, requiring a lot of space to move around, growing slowly, that ultimately leads them to be more vulnerable to pressures like overexploitation. Okay, so we have these benefits and we have these risks associated with biodiversity in aquatic food systems. And like I said, not every species has the same benefits or the same risks. So what we wanted to do then is ask, how do these benefits and risks align? Do they essentially provide for opportunities, or are we stuck in a quandary? So what do I mean by that? Well, here I'm going to show you a way to think about the benefits and costs at the same time. So on the x-axis, and this is a graph that I'm going to populate with different points, each corresponding to a species that we have data for. So on the x-axis is this vulnerability score. So I want you to think about this as the ecological risk. And when species and points fall towards the right, that means that those species, because of their traits like body size, because of how much space they need, they tend to be more vulnerable to some of these drivers of extinction, like overexploitation. When species fall towards the left, it means that those species tend to be more resilient to some of these pressures. So that's the x-axis again is our ecosystem health axis. Now the y-axis is going to represent our public health axis. And because we have all of these different dimensions of public health, both benefits like multiple micronutrients, but also risks like contaminants like mercury, we need to put all of that together. And so we're going to put that together in a way that's a little bit complicated, but I want you to just have some intuition about what this y-axis means. When points fall toward the top, it means that those species have high mercury content, but low nutrient density. So from the perspective of consuming, these are species that we want to avoid. When points fall towards the bottom, those species have low mercury content and high nutrient density. So those would be species that are nutritionally beneficial. And again, I'm going to show you a bunch of different points corresponding to different species. And they're going to be sized by how much they cost at market. Okay, it's a price at market as a measure of how accessible they are. And they're going to be colored by whether their consumption exceeds EPA guidelines for mercury contamination. So red species we want to absolutely avoid. So what do we see? Well, we see that species like these large migratory catfish, those ones that are vulnerable, that also have high mercury content and low nutrient density. So these are lose-lose propositions. These are species that are best to avoid from both the perspective of ecosystem health, but also from the perspective of public health. We also see that there's species like these smaller guys, they are relatively resilient. They're small, they don't need that much space, they grow really quickly, so ecologically resilient, but they also have low mercury content and high nutrient density. So these are win-wins. And if you plot all of the species that we have information for across this space, we'll see that there's this general trend where species that tend to be less vulnerable also have higher benefits for nutrition, and species that tend to be more vulnerable tend to have higher mercury content and lower nutritional benefits. And in reality, we see this variation because there is biodiversity, right? Without that incredible variation of species, we wouldn't have this spread. So I like to say that biodiversity provides opportunities. And we can scale this work up globally and ask similar questions across different fisheries-based geographies. And what we find is that when there is more biodiversity, there are more opportunities. And so biodiversity can be really good for providing us with the benefits that we need. Of course, fish are one picture of the broader food system. So I just talked a lot about capture fisheries, but Katie introduced aquaculture. Eric's going to talk a little bit more aquaculture. We also farm other animals like livestock and poultry. And so when we start to consider, and we also, of course, consume a lot of plants. And so when we start to consider these different food items, we need to not only consider the added and the different benefits nutritionally that they provide, say fiber, et cetera, but we also need to consider the costs that are associated with growing them, habitat change for agriculture, pollution, et cetera. And so fish are one component of that broader food system. Okay, so if there's anything that you take away from the last 12, 15 minutes, I hope it's this thing. We do have a moral imperative to conserve biodiversity. We're causing this massive extinction event. But at the same time, it goes beyond the morality. Biodiversity can benefit food system sustainability. And why is that? Well, because it enhances complementarity. And this idea of complementarity goes beyond fish. Having more opportunities, more things to choose from enhances our ability to choose those that are most resilient. So it enhances resilience. And I didn't talk too much about this, but there is this overlapping geography between fisheries biodiversity and fisheries dependence. What does that mean? Well, places where people depend more heavily on fish are places where there's higher biodiversity. So these opportunities to use biodiversity strategically can make the biggest dent where it's needed the most. So with that, I'll leave it and I'll pass the mic back to you, Steve.
Great. Thanks so much, Sebastian. Truly fascinating to consider these critical feedback loops between the state of aquatic biodiversity and the people so dependent upon it. So thanks so much for sharing what you've been finding. I'd like to now introduce our final speaker today, Dr. Eric Teplitz, who is a veterinarian and PhD candidate on Dr. Fiorella's team, studying the rapidly growing aquaculture industry in central and western Kenya. His research focuses on disease surveillance, antimicrobial resistance, aquaculture biosecurity, human nutrition, and fish health, with particular emphasis on the cage aquaculture industry in Lake Victoria. Dr. Teplitz's work in Kenya promotes capacity development and extension in fish health diagnostics, epidemiology, microbiology, and the management of cage aquaculture systems. Eric, it is great to have you with us, and over to you. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Dr. Osofsky, for the very kind introduction. So today I'm going to be talking more about the health side, both on the animal health side, environmental health side, and human health side, and how those things are critical to the sustainable development of aquaculture. Now, Katie mentioned that these food systems are growing really rapidly, and aquaculture is among them. And often as they grow, they commercialize and intensify. And as we pack these animals closer together, the risk and consequences of animal disease intensifies as well. And so I'm going to be talking about the fish health side and using Lake Victoria in East Africa as a case study. So as Katie mentioned, aquaculture historically and still today is predominantly based in Asia. However, aquaculture growth rates in Africa are the highest among the world. So you can see in this figure, these gray bars is the most recent time this analysis has been done, and you can see the growth rates in Africa are the highest in the world. But at the same time, Africa is such a small share of the total global production. So on this figure on the right, aquaculture production is shown in red and capture fisheries production is shown in the light blue. And you can see Africa towards the bottom, and you can see that red bar of aquaculture is expanding very rapidly, but it's still such a small share of total global production. And so this presents an opportunity to improve livelihoods and human nutrition using those benefits that Katie and Sebastian have outlined. But the key thing is that in order to fulfill this promise of aquaculture expansion, we need to keep the fish alive. And so I think one of the key messages here today is that fish health and disease management are really critical to the sustainable development of aquaculture, especially as these industries commercialize and intensify and disease risk increases. So across Africa, there are some emblematic challenges. There are gaps in biosecurity, which are the practices that fish health professionals and farmers can take that mitigate the risk of introduction and transmission of diseases onto farms. There's poor capacity in diagnosing disease, both from a human capital standpoint and access to the equipment and laboratories that you'd need to diagnose disease. Often there's a lack of disease reporting systems and information sharing among stakeholders. Low quality aquaculture feeds and fingerlings and emerging diseases like tilapia lake virus, which you may have heard of. On the environmental health side, we need to balance aquaculture production with environmental health. And polluted waters impact fish health, but also aquaculture production contributes to the nutrient pollution that then feeds back and affects the fish themselves. And so when these things go awry, we can have things like toxic algae blooms, nitrogen and phosphorus overload leading to eutrophic aquatic systems, antibiotic residues from aquaculture and from livestock agriculture leaking into aquatic systems, and pollution of both aquatic and terrestrial environments from industrial uses as well. On the human health side, we need to keep an eye on zoonotic disease, which is the transmission of disease from animals to humans. Often we don't know the nutritional or toxin content in fish that people are consuming, often in tropical areas, and of course, keeping an eye on the looming threat of antimicrobial resistance, which is one of the biggest global health threats of our time. And so these challenges fit really nicely into a One Health framework. And I think this underscores the responsibility to address these issues comprehensively through a One Health approach as the most effective way of dealing with them. So aquaculture development, now I'm going to talk about East Africa and using it as a case study. So aquaculture development in Kenya specifically began really around 2008, 2009 after the global financial crisis. And the government of Kenya implemented an economic stimulus program and incentivized the production of fingerling and feed production facilities. So this led to the creation of pond farms across the country of Kenya. But more recently, there's been an explosion of cage aquaculture industry in Lake Victoria. And so Lake Victoria, you can see here on the map, is sandwiched between Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And it's the second largest lake in the world, provides livelihoods to tens of millions of people. And you may have heard the famous story of the introduction of the predatory Nile perch in the 1950s by British colonialists, which led to this Nile perch predating on and leading to the extinction of many, many species of native cichlids and transformed this critical ecosystem. And Lake Victoria is very dynamic. It has thousands of small-scale fishers, a cage aquaculture industry, and it's also struggling with environmental health challenges, such as these toxic algae blooms that you can see here. And in many ways, Lake Victoria is also the epicenter of cage aquaculture in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's been documented to host the largest number of cage operations among all African inland waters. And 10 years ago, there were virtually no cages in the lake, and today there's upwards of 8,000 or 10,000, so it really exploded quite quickly. And the industry is dynamic too, ranging anywhere from small-scale operations with 2-meter by 2-meter cages with a cooperative of farmers that got together and stocked it with 50 tilapia, ranging all the way up to 30-meter diameter HDPE cages backed by American venture capitalists and harvesting upwards of 40 metric tons of tilapia per day. So it's a really lot of production scales in this industry. And so I just want to show you a video of what this looks like on the ground. For those not familiar with aquaculture cages, these types are square or rectangular metal frame cages, and there's a net that hangs underneath them. Farmers stock the net with tilapia, and at the end of feeding them for months and months, they lift the net, harvest the tilapia, and maybe stock more fish in it. And so you can see in this one site, there are actually thousands of cages in just one bay in Kenya. And I want to emphasize that this industry is not without challenges. There have been increasing fish kills, increasingly common in this region, leading to mass mortalities in tilapia. And these fish kill events are getting a lot of international media attention. And the reason for that is warranted. These fish kills can have catastrophic livelihood impacts. Imagine if you're a small-scale farmer, you've maybe taken out a loan, borrowed money to invest in cage materials, buy fingerlings, paying for feed and labor to feed these fish every day, and then 6 or 7 months later, in the blink of an eye, all of your fish are dead, and there's no robust insurance mechanism. So these can have really significant impacts on livelihoods. So what is our team doing about it? The first step that we took was a gap analysis of production practices and biosecurity practices. And the idea here is to try and figure out what are the practices that the farmer is doing that could be improved a little bit? Or maybe what are the practices that they're not implementing that would improve the efficiency and reduce risk of disease on their operations? And so we interviewed around 172 cage farmers in Lake Victoria, which is more than half of them on the Kenyan side, and focused on these production practices. And our most striking finding was on biosecurity. And so there's really a significant absence in biosecurity practices. So many farmers are reporting consuming dead fish, which is a risk of zoonotic disease transmission, feeding them to other animals, or tossing them into the lake where they can wash up against one of their neighbors' cages. And if this fish died from an infectious disease, such as a virus or a bacteria, and it's still releasing those agents, by washing up against someone else's cages, you're leading to increased risk of disease transmission. Very few farmers are contacting organizations for assistance. And even when they do report, there's a lack of coordination and disease reporting systems that stakeholders can respond to these events. Very few farmers are disinfecting scoop nets and tools. And so imagine you've got 100 dead fish in your cage. The farmer might use a scoop net to remove them and then move on over to another cage. And if those fish have died from an infectious agent, that's a really good way of transmitting disease to another cage. Farmers often stock fingerlings from different sources, which is a risk just because, just like in other animals and in people, fish can be asymptomatic carriers for infectious diseases. And so if you're bringing in animals from all different places, unwittingly, you could be introducing disease onto your farm. Farmers often use partial harvests because they often don't have a market where they can sell all of their fish at once. So they'll harvest maybe a few at a time and then bring them to the market. But this is risky from a disease standpoint because harvesting the fish is really stressful. And stress in people and in animals and in fish is immunosuppressive. And so the fish that remain in the net that you didn't harvest are at an increased risk of disease. And finally, farmers don't have access to antimicrobial, fish-formulated antimicrobials that they can use properly. Most farmers report using salt to treat their fish, but I'll note that antimicrobial use is heavily stigmatized, and I've had farmers anecdotally tell me that they're using livestock-formulated antibiotics and sprinkling it on top of the aquaculture feed. Okay, we also, the next step was to address those gaps in knowledge that we identified in the survey. And so we did cage farmer workshops. And so we often broke farmers up into groups and asked them thought-provoking questions such as, what do you think is the cause for the mortalities on your farm? Or how should you respond adequately to a fish disease outbreak? And we stationed fish health professionals at each station, had the farmers rotate through groups, and tried to increase network and information sharing among the farmers. We've also done capacity building in fish health diagnostics. And so we brought Dr. Rod Getchell, who's a professor at Cornell University and also a faculty fellow at the Cornell Lisa Yang Center for Wildlife Health, to lead workshops in Western and Central Kenya focused on fish health. And we had folks from the State Department, we had veterinarians, folks from the Kenya Fisheries Service, Kenya Marine and Fisheries Research Institute, to try and increase the number of people that can diagnose disease. And I've led some similar efforts with some hands-on training with Kenyan scientists, community members, and farmers to try and increase the ability broadly to recognize and respond to disease. And finally, we've done disease surveillance to try and identify what are the pathogens that are primarily affecting the industry and seeing if these pathogens are resistant to the therapeutics that we have available. So this is what some of that looks like. And I'm just going to really quickly run through a few cases just to show you what some of those fish diseases might look like. So here you can see on the fish on the left, there's some really severe tail and fin erosions. The fish in the middle has an abnormal eye opacity, and we had diagnosed this fish with a bacterial disease, specifically Aeromonas. We've also seen cases of fungal disease. You can see this white accumulation at the base of the fins of this fish. And if you were to take that, put it on a microscope slide and look at it, you can see these fungal hyphae. And this is likely a species called Saprolegnia. We've also seen parasitic disease. So this red linear organ along the spine of the fish is the kidney. And you can see these yellow cysts embedded within the kidney. If you were to open one of those cysts, you can see the organism on the right, which is a Metasicaria for a fluke known as Euclinostomum. These long tendrils with the red lines running through it. That's what fish gills look like under a microscope. And you can see on the left, we have a protozoan parasite called Trichodyna. On the right, one more, we've got a gill fluke. And then the two images on the right are an external parasite called anchorworm. And so I hope I've left you with the message that fish health and disease management in East Africa and across the world are critical to the sustainable development of aquaculture. And I'd like to thank our partners at ILRI, Chemfree, Cornell, and a lot of this work was funded by USAID. And I want to thank many others who participated in this work. And with that, thank you very much. And I appreciate it. Thank you for coming.
Great. Well, what a rich mix of presentations. We have a few minutes left, so we will take some questions from the audience. I'm going to start off with a couple that struck me. Can we get all the panelists back up on the screen? My first question is for Sebastian. Sebastian, you made such an important case regarding the relationship between the public health impacts of certain species and their nutritional value, as well as their ecological vulnerability. How are you seeing success, or what approaches are you taking, both at the community level and the governmental level, in terms of policy? In other words, deterring people from maybe harvesting those long-lived large catfish species, getting them to eat down the food chain. Are you seeing progress with those kinds of recommendations?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for the question. Well, it's a multi-pronged approach. We can start out by thinking about how to change consumers' behaviors, and that's very challenging. We've seen certain campaigns that have success. And so one of the ways that we try to kind of spread the word is through providing information to people. So essentially being able to provide that nutritional content information, which oftentimes isn't accessible, to people that need it the most through products that are accessible to them, like a fish guide, or recipes. Other ways that some partners have been able to do that is by having these fish fairs. And so having an event where they bring top chefs that come and they cook small fish species, and then those small fish species are cooked in a very attractive way. And so there's a number of different ways at the consumer level. Now, at a more kind of high scale or kind of a wider approach is working with governments, right, to be able to enact, trait-based fisheries regulations. What does that mean? Fish small, for example. Also providing that same information to regional food security type of interventions. And so really this is a multi-pronged approach. It's long-term, but there's a lot of different things that we can do. And we oftentimes do see some behavior changing. We haven't measured that yet, and I'd love to maybe do that in the future.
Sure. No, it's a long game. Eric, one of the things we haven't had a chance to talk about that I just wanted to bring up, your background as a livestock veterinarian and your early experience, I just see so many parallels between what you described and what I see in my work in Southern Africa at that interface between livestock and wildlife. Can you say anything about what we should be thinking about as scientists regarding the interface between aquaculture and what's left of free-ranging fish species, some of the disease issues that this industry threatens, but I guess disease and genetic concerns, whether it's what you're seeing in Lake Victoria or salmon farming in Norway. I mean, not to pick on any one country, but just that issue in general. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'll comment first from a genetic standpoint. In Lake Victoria, Nile tilapia specifically is an invasive species. There are native species, tilapia species to Lake Victoria, but Nile tilapia is invasive. And oftentimes when farmers are harvesting, they're lifting nets and fish are jumping out. So I think the wild and farm populations in many ways in Lake Victoria have become interchangeable for many of those reasons, which is unfortunate. Disease transmission is definitely a concern. In some of the surveys that we've implemented, farmers have noticed that either wild fish start dying and then the next day they'll notice their cage fish start dying, or vice versa. So I think the link between farmed and wild population health is really clear. And the last thing that I would say, comparing livestock systems to aquaculture, of course, the environmental health and the environment of the animal is always important to the health of the animal as well. You can think of dairy cows in a dirty environment are more likely to get mastitis. Poultry in a poorly ventilated barn are more likely to get respiratory disease. But I would say in aquaculture, that link is even more clear because the fish are immersed and live in that environment. And so for me, it really emphasizes the importance of environmental health, because if that water is polluted and the quality of that water deteriorates, it really has a significant impact on fish health. And I would say that water quality is one of the most important, if not the most important aspect of fish health.
Thank you very much for that. There are a lot of questions coming in. We'll get to as many as we can now. Katie, for you, I saw a lot of USAID logos on the slides. I can tell you I was a AAAS fellow at USAID early in my career. It was a pivotal opportunity. Can you comment on the impacts of losing USAID on work that's helping to feed the world and alleviate poverty?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, as you saw in some of the logos, the USAID Fish Innovation Lab, which was part of this Feed the Future effort that USAID had undertaken now for a long time, had funded some of this work, especially Eric's work that he talked about on fish health. We also had funding from them that was going to fund an expansion of this work, and those have been canceled. So some of that work was stopped in the middle, and then the next project won't go forward. And I think, the places that we're talking about are far away. And so it can be tempting to think about some of the challenges that are being faced here as a challenge for Kenya or a challenge for Lake Victoria. But the reality is that 80% of the fish in the United States are imported. Our supply of these fish and our contributions to this global aquatic food system is very much intertwined with what's happening in other places. And so when we think about fish health and the ability of our global settings to produce fish, it really depends on everywhere. I think the other point to make about that maybe is that aquaculture in the US is certainly an industry that's present, but it is not very large. And so thinking about the expansion of aquaculture here in the future and the potential of that, it has been at points an effort that really we've thought a lot about investing in, understanding context and learning lessons from places that have invested in aquaculture substantially and have seen really quick expansion and what's been challenging there and how we can get ahead of some of these challenges, also incredibly valuable at home. Yeah, so I think the impacts are really potentially very severe in both local and global terms.
No, thank you for that. Well said. A lot of the questions relate to the safety and nutritional value of farm versus wild fish. I'm going to refer people to a recent article in the New York Times where both Katie and Sebastian were interviewed, and if the Cornell folks can bring that URL into the public chat, that would be great. Perhaps we have time for one or two more questions. Eric, as a veterinarian, there's a question about how do you figure out what is affecting a sick or dead fish? I mean, you showed some different pictures, but can you just describe your clinical approach? This is basically detective work.
Thanks for the great question. So I would say you start it the same way you would in any other animal. And in veterinary school, they emphasize the importance of the case history. And that's how I would always start, is try and get history, try and talk to the farmer, understand the timeline of what happened, and try and get any information that you're not going to be able to get when you get there and start inspecting the scene. So that I would say the history is a critical first step. When you get there, then you're going to start looking for clinical signs in the fish that are alive. You're going to want to sample a combination of fish that ideally have recently died or are sick and still alive, as well as a sample of healthy fish. And then you're going to do a comprehensive necropsy, the same way you would in any other animal. And so you're going to comprehensively inspect all the organs. You're going to look for clinical signs, abnormal swimming behavior. Maybe they are moving their operculum, which is the covering over the gills, which might indicate low oxygen. So look for clinical signs, behavioral signs like that, inspect all of the organs, look for pathology, and then you're going to take a deeper look based on your suspicions for microbiology. So you might preserve some samples in RNA later, for example, is a preservative that's good for doing subsequent molecular work like virology, PCR, et cetera. You can also do bacterial cultures. And in fish, one of the best places to do that is the kidney, which is that organ that I showed earlier. And so you're going to swab the kidney, do some bacterial cultures, and then just like in any other animal, you're going to have your differential list, and you're going to work through all of your diagnostic information and your case history and come up with a conclusion. The challenge is, I would say, my concluding point is that fish rot very quickly. And so I would really emphasize the importance of getting there quickly and doing a rapid response, because the quality of information you get will deteriorate very quickly as the fish does.
Sure. No, thank you for that comprehensive answer. I think because we're closing in on the hour, can we put up the next slide, and we'll share some last resources and then conclude the webinar. I wish we had 2 hours. All right, trying to advance the slide there. Can we go to the next slide? There we go. Thank you. So I want to thank all our panelists again for just a rich sharing of information and discussion. And if you want to learn more about One Health and the underwater world, you might want to explore the Aquadocs podcast, which is the #1 aquatic animal health podcast started by our own College of Veterinary Medicine alum, Michelle Greenfield Feig, class of 2023. So I just wanted to plug an excellent source of information. And if you want to know more about the Cornell K. Yang Center for Wildlife Health and our work around the world, you can go to wildlife.cornell.edu. You can scan that QR code or find us on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, etc. We really try and make a lot of our resources, a lot of the research findings, available to our colleagues, to the public. And so, we want to be a resource to you. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today. We hope to continue this series, One Health Around the World, so stay tuned. And again, thanks for your time. Have a good afternoon, everybody.